Restorying the Culture is hosted by Tanya Taylor Rubinstein, story mentor, and Camille Adair, family constellation facilitator. In this podcast, these long-term friends explore how stories serve our lives. Their inquiry meanders into the realms of science, theater, health, and consciousness, moving the individual and global narratives forward as they draw upon their relationship as the laboratory for their experiments in truth. So many of us feel isolated and alone in our deepest longings. Each one of us is necessary in rediscovering the truth of our human story and listening to what is calling us forward so that we can restory the culture together.
Welcome to the podcast, Restorying the Culture, the Conversation, Medicine for Small Talk with Camille and Tanya. This is episode number 1, and our topic today is Restorying the Mother. And before we get started, I just want to welcome our audience and introduce us a little bit and in terms of the intention for this podcast. Tanya and I have been friends for over 20 years, and we've gone through what longtime friends go through: illness, divorce, having children, worrying about our children, having business successes, having business losses, relationship challenges. And what we've decided that we want to do is to take the vulnerability of this friendship with all that we hold with it that contributes to our wholeness and bring it to the public as a model for how women can be leaders together through vulnerability. And so you'll hear us sharing a lot about our personal relationship. And that's one of the great gifts of this life, is to have a female friend who's willing to walk through the stuff in the same way that maybe we think we're committed to walking through with in a marriage partnership or something. But oftentimes we don't bring that kind of commitment and intimacy to our female friendships. So what I'd like to do in introducing our podcast, Restorying the Mother, is I'd like to have Tanya talk a little bit about why restorying.
Thank you so much, Camille, and hello to our new listeners. We're so excited to be here with you. So at this moment in the culture, and where we actually are actually standing while we are making this very first episode of our podcast, that we planned it earlier, is in the midst of the coronavirus. Where most of us in the U.S. right now are being asked to stay at home. So standing in this place, obviously, clearly, the paradigm is shifting. The global, the way we've done things locally, in families, in the culture, and globally at large, all bets are off, right? Everything's changing. Old models are blowing up, breaking apart, and something new will be growing out of this. Something new. There is opportunity here to create new narratives for how we live, for how we love, for how we work, for how we relate to each other, for how we communicate. There will be new ways of working, new ways of being. And the call, of course, is towards a more sustainable future for our children, our grandchildren, and the earth herself. So Camille and I both have decades of experience between us. Camille has been a hospice nurse. She has been a documentary filmmaker, and she is currently an incredible ancestral family constellation facilitator, deep healer. I have been in my life a solo performer, a writer, an actor. That's my deep root system, and a story coach and story worker, helping thousands of people over the last 20 years share their stories in books and on stages. So between us, we have incredible background and experience, and it's very complementary, yet also very unique in terms of story and the importance of story. And so we're here to share that. And hopefully inspire and support you in restoring your own lives.
And I'll just add to that, part of how restoring came up for us is that we have often shared clients. And what we've realized is that there is a story beneath the story. And that oftentimes the story that's above ground, that's in our conscious awareness, that story can reinforce suffering and difficult dynamics in our lives. And so we kind of came together in this commitment to help bring out a new story that is not inside conscious awareness. And between the two of us, we have tools for how we do that, how we take people deep to recognize things about their own story and their own families that they may not be consciously aware of. So now Tanya's going to share a quote that's dedicated to restoring the mother.
Exactly. So this quote is actually a quote from a friend of mine, a very dear mentor of mine for many years, Peggy O'Mara, who was the founder of Mothering magazine, and which was a very, if you don't know it, innovative magazine about attachment parenting and restoring the narrative of parenting in our culture. She has impacted many, I would say hundreds of thousands, if not millions of children and families. So this quote from Peggy is, "The way we talk to our children becomes their inner voice." The way we talk to our children becomes their inner voice. So just sort of moving into our conversation, Camille, and I know you know Peggy as well and know that quote. What does that quote mean to you?
What it means to me is it takes me actually to sort of this lineage place, which is not a way that we think about ourselves in this culture, because we have a tendency to be so individualistic. And I think what it speaks to is the interconnectedness that the mother lives inside of us always. And I think that we have sort of lost our way to track the thing that gave us life, the things that is sort of like informing the very, very root system of our being. And so that quote for me brings that concept into conscious awareness, just about how children are these vessels that we fill, and then as the children, like part of how Tanya and I are restoring is to say, what was I filled with? What were those voices that I was filled with? And rather than and actually being vulnerable, we feel the blessing of some of that, and we feel the pain of that. And then how do we lean into that and move into a place of sovereignty in our own lives, where we are able to take the mother with all that it cost her and all that it cost us as the one who gave us life. Some of us have really active relationships with our mothers as friends, and it's a very loving connection. Some people don't. Some people have very difficult histories. But the one thing that is a truth for all of us is that we all have one person who passed life on to us, who is the link to our ancestral lineage. And by acknowledging that and seeing the mother as the one who passed life on, it makes us stronger. And I'd love to know what you think, Tanya.
Yeah, I mean, I love everything you've said, Camille, and it's so much of our work here. And I want to share very intimately a little bit about my own process with my mom. And I think about that, how the places in myself, and of course, and I also want to say this extends to all my clients I've worked with over many years, working with so many people. I'm getting on stage to share their own stories. I've worked with people around their, stories of having had cancer, all kinds of issues, many performers, all the intimate story. And what I notice is where there's creative block and where there's an inner critic, it's very likely a mother's voice. It is occasionally a teacher's voice, but the mother is so close. The aspects of ourself, and I'll just say this for myself, the aspects of myself that have been hardest for me to heal and actually not, to embrace, have been areas where my mom's been critical of me. And this morning, before Camille and I started this podcast, I had a little breakdown and started crying to her and saying, I feel very comfortable sharing my vulnerable stories. That's actually part of what I've always been attracted to and do as a solo performer, story worker. But I really judge myself and I'm highly critical of myself for where I feel unfocused, disorganized, and like messy. Like I'm messy in my paperwork. I'm messy in my house. I was never formally diagnosed with ADHD as a child. I was as an adult. I often help my own clients reframe that diagnosis. I call it creative brain and shaman's brain. There's a spiritual and creative component to the way it's neurodiversity issues too. It's to the way we're wired. But my mom she was a neatnik and a bit of a control freak. And so she would really shame me, honestly, around like being messy. And I wasn't intentionally messy. I just didn't know how to organize things outside of myself. I can organize story internally. And I can track the tiniest details with story and never forget, but I don't organize spatially in my environment. So, here I am 55 years old and we're doing this podcast, about these deep topics. And I'm like, up against my own vulnerability and understanding like that's still a part of myself. I feel really critical about, almost to the point that I didn't want to get on here this morning because I thought Camille was going to judge me. She doesn't, for ways I judge myself, but that's still that inner voice. On a positive side, because I think with a mother, it's so easy, as Camille was saying, for us to focus on criticizing. That's been my path. And my criticism back of my mother and judgment made me pull away from her for decades. And my last several years have been restoring and restoring that relationship and having intimacy with my mom again. She's 80 years old, but I haven't had really since I was a child. But like, I have a really unusual relationship, I would say, in Western culture with my body, in the sense that I accept myself. And I think that has to do also with my mother in my lineage. And this is very typical in Western culture. My mom was a bit overweight and my grandma was a bit overweight. And yet in our family, the emphasis wasn't on our bodies. It was on our intellect and on our talent. So I was really validated for my writing talent and for being intelligent and being a good reader. Those things were very, very celebrated in my family. And I can honestly say that I went through my whole childhood without anybody criticizing or really commenting on my body. My weight would go up and then down. And as a teenager, I got acne. There wasn't a lot of commentary on the body. And I'm so grateful because I work with so many women, and this is so throughout the culture, women who suffer so deeply because of their body and body image. And even in aging, I feel quite an unusual bit of acceptance around that. And I know that was a tremendous gift in my female legacy that now I can really notice. So it's like, but once again, that root system of whether we've been judged and criticized or whether we got something very healthy and positive and accepting, boy, doesn't it show up, Camille, like in us, like whatever that thing is, it's there in such a core way when that imprint is so young. And then, of course, the narrative extends forward and backwards in our generations.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that I think is a result of all of what you're saying is that because we don't know how to create a home for the mother within, right? I mean, we have a tendency to push the mother out as part of our individuation process, but we don't know that actual true individuation means that first I have this image of belly on the ground, right? Because what shows up in my work with clients oftentimes is that sort of people feel much bigger than their mothers, that they're larger than life. And the mother is the one who's sort of kind of feet on the ground and more grounded. And so it's about bringing people into like being able to be the human child to that mother. And I oftentimes we use this image of putting your belly on the ground and connecting with Mother Earth first, and then coming up and seeing your mother as the one who passed life on, with all the vulnerability that might be there around that, and even all the pain, just acknowledging what is. That's where a lot of the healing is, because when we don't do that, as you and I have had years of conversations around, and we've actually experienced this in our friendship, is how tricky it is for women not to project their mother wound onto female friends. And I think that that's one of the things that, you and I have dipped in and out of, and sometimes we've not been conscious of it, but we've come to a place where then we are conscious, and we do see kind of what's the dynamics that are underneath sort of the reactions or the behaviors. And for me, with my own personal mother, my mom was a teenager when I was born. She was pregnant with me when she graduated from high school in 1965. And so for me, a lot of my work has been about giving myself permission to be the child and not being the mother to the mother. And even though my mother is very much my mother, it was more like being the firstborn, and sort of just the way that a lot of that came about in my wiring was a lot of hypervigilance and feeling like I needed to be the grown-up at a very, very young age. And I think I love hearing your stories, and I actually have this great visual image of your mom tap dancing in a leotard, and I'm grateful to have met your mom in person. And so I know what you're saying in terms of the body lack, that you don't have body shame.
And I want to say, and just to share, can I open that up for a second? Just the image for our readers, for our listeners. My mother and my grandmother. So my grandmother was in her mid 80s and my mom in her mid 60s, and they were in a touring tap dancing group called the Dancing Grannies. And they would go around together with like 6 other women in the troupe and tap dance in their 80s and 60s in leotards, and both of them, by conventional standards, overweight. And I'll tell you, my mom and my grandma, who had to dance with her cane, were just out there selling it to the audience, like with big smiles on their faces and doing turns, and there was no body consciousness. And I got to see them in a performance back in Maryland. And it makes me cry thinking about it. An incredible gift.
That is a gift. Unfortunately, I feel like in my family lineage, and I don't attribute this to my mom personally, but I do think it has more to do with Northern European ancestry and sort of this don't stand out. It's almost like there's a sense of it's not okay to really be attractive or beautiful. And I think the body shaming, it fits right in there, where there's this value, which is really great, that has to do with humility. And I think humility is an important value that definitely is part of my family system and ancestral value system. But I think the thing with humility is that it can actually move into humiliation. And when we don't know how to honor the feminine, and we don't know how to honor the feminine in our mother line, that's transmitted to men and women, to all genders in our ancestral lineage. And shame is such a tricky thing, that it is sort of like this. It can be this toxic, silent underminer of our ability to even celebrate our own lives. And so that's been one of the things that I have worked on my whole life, and still work on, like how to celebrate my own womanness and my own motherness and my aging.
This is such a huge topic. I know we're going to be like unpacking this in so many ways, and getting out of whatever that critical internalized voices that is bigger than an individual mother, right? Like you're connecting it back. I know you've shared with me about your Swedish ancestry in particular, like cultural stuff that has made it hard to stand out and celebrate your unique brilliance, which is so huge, but that there's a thing about that. And another thing I want to talk about just briefly is touching on like the patriarchy, right? And I think as women, this is the era of Me Too, but there's so much like sort of confrontation towards men in the patriarchy around their very inappropriate behavior, the sexual stuff and abuses of power, which we know runs through every facet of the story. But what I want to say is the shadow aspect to me as women, us not calling ourselves out on when we stay separate from each other, and when we marginalize each other, and when we're hypercritical of each other, and when we're competing rather than celebrating and collaborating with each other, we too, on the outside, may be saying, like down with the patriarchy, but we've internalized the behavior and we're harming other women, not by being sexual predators, but we're harming other women by our inability and unwillingness to celebrate and share power. And I just want to say that's one of the most beautiful things in our relationship is even what we're doing here right now, to me, challenges that wound that we can be too powerful, imperfect, complex women with complex histories and come here and be willing to be vulnerable. The restorying, and I think an invitation to our listeners is like just a reflection on, where am I cut off in my beautiful connection to the and also that we make our mothers like it's that virgin whore thing, right? In Christianity, the virgin and the prostitute, we've split off, but rather can we allow ourselves, our female friends, our daughters, our granddaughters, and all our own mothers to be imperfect, complex, multidimensional humans who make mistakes and give great gifts, and can we let ourselves be that?
This reminds me of something that happened with my own daughter, my oldest daughter, that shows also the way things can change in the generations. And I remember when I started my menstrual cycle, it was all about how do I hide this, right? It was uncomfortable, it was messy. It was sort of the thing that like you just have to bear. As a young woman, it's the thing that you just have to bear. And it's like the curse, right? I mean, people talk about it as the curse, all the language that we would ascribe to something like, in a sacred way, we think of it as the moon cycle. And I think about what my daughter went through when she started her menstrual cycle. And she literally was so excited. It was sort of like, woohoo, I started. And she wanted to call friends, including family friends, male friends who were like my parents' age. She wanted to like announce it to the world. And I remember thinking, wow, this is one of those places where a change happened. I don't know how it happened, but a change, very significantly changed for my daughter's generation. Not that they don't carry a lot of what I carry, but I also think it's really, and I loved what you said about knowing that like, why is it that we have such a hard time showing compassion to our own mothers? It's like we have this thing that they should have been perfect, but they were children too, with their imperfect mothers. And oftentimes this is an ancestral pattern that can happen. And a lot of times the work that I do is actually one of the most fundamental things I do is to try and restore the nurturing and the care and the flow of love in the maternal line, because it oftentimes feels so broken that there's just no nourishment. And so I've even begun bringing in breast milk as an element to try and moisten and bring back the sweetness of life to a female line. So for us to know that all that our mothers did that was hard for us is a reflection of all that was done that was hard for them. And for us to see this as a systemic relational pattern, I think is really helpful so that we can actually understand that the suffering and the pain that we've gone through is not in vain, and that it was not in vain for our mothers or their mothers, and that we have the gift of this kind of consciousness right now that we can actually start to work on the repair of our lineage.
I think, yes, and I just want to say, I think this is all really radical work. And I want to really acknowledge that radical simply means to get to the root system. And the root system is the mother in our bodies, but it's also the Mother Earth. And that the feminine and the darkness and the mother is found underground. It's our indigenous root system. And each of us was indigenous once. And you and I have had these conversations for a long time because we live here in New Mexico and are very in touch with indigenous native people to the Americas here. But we were all indigenous to a place once. I was indigenous. My ancestors were indigenous to areas now known as Scotland and England and France primarily, and Ireland. And rather than appropriate indigenous culture of other people, to return and heal the mother wound, I know for me, it's been so deeply about returning to a sense of my own indigenous nature, and also walking things out on the land, getting with the roots, being with the earth herself, to heal my human relationship with my mother. And if we've projected the split on the planet right now and our relationship with the earth on our one individual mother, how can she hold that? No one can hold that. We're projecting the collective conscious and the wounding of the mother in this moment and going back generations on this one human. And it's so humbling because I have a daughter, you have two daughters. So humbling when my daughter was an adolescent, and that her own anger started coming to me. And I wanted to say, Chloe, I'm not that. It was so big. But then to understand, I'd done the same to my own mother, making all of the traumas of life, the patriarchy, being a woman, having, terrible sexual and violent experiences, and projecting that all on this one human, my mother, the struggling human, and then watching my daughter do it to me. But returning to our own connection with the darkness underground, the roots of the mother, right? What do you want to say about that? Because we talk about this stuff all the time.
Well, and I think when we think of the underground, it's that which is not in conscious awareness. It includes death. It includes the life that is germinating in the seed that holds everything that it needs to reproduce. It's that things actually don't really die. They change. That there is this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth that's held underground that is part of our inheritance. And we oftentimes are walking around living a half-life because we're only connected above ground, which means most of us are walking around connected from the belly button up, very much so, but we are not grounded from the belly button down. And anyway, so this is what a great conversation, what a great first episode. I'm very excited about how this is going to unfold. And it's, as always, such an inspiration to be able to go to these deep places for you, because as we laugh and talk about, sometimes we both have like an allergy to small talk. So
that's how we got, right? That's how we got our subtitle. Because, yeah, it's wonderful. And the last thing I want to say is to our listeners, we're grateful you're here. And, all of this, this conversation is not in a bubble. We're including you. We're sharing our own intimacy, but we're including you. And I think what that means will reveal itself more and more as we go. But we're honored to bring you into our intimate space. And we were just talking about it this morning. The culture's dying of intimacy. We're all longing for intimacy, and that's why we're showing up. And it can be a practice to learn to risk being intimate in what can often feel like an unsafe world. And yet the intimacy with ourselves and each other really just may be part of the medicine for these times of restoring, getting closer when the impulse is to want to move away. And so I guess I just want to say the invitation here is we're inviting you in closer with them.
And I think the nexus of intimacy and our ability to have relationship, it is tied to the mother. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you for joining Camille and Tanya for this episode of Restorying the Culture. If you were inspired, we would deeply appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes or any other platform where you heard our podcast. For more ongoing inspiration and support, please join our no-cost global Facebook community, Restorying the Culture. You can support our podcast by making a donation here. And remember, we are each restoring the culture as we restory our own lives. See you next time.